At 4:17 a.m., urgent maritime alerts began flashing across military command centers, oil trading desks, and shipping control rooms around the world. Reports were emerging of new clashes in the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway responsible for carrying nearly a fifth of the world's oil supply. Within minutes, tanker operators were rerouting vessels, naval forces were moving into higher alert positions, and financial markets were preparing for another wave of instability. The region had already been tense for weeks. Diplomats were discussing peace proposals. Washington was waiting for Tehran's response to a possible deal. But suddenly, all of that was being overshadowed by a dangerous reality unfolding directly in the Gulf itself. The strait was becoming unstable again. Initial reports described sporadic clashes involving U.S. and Iranian naval units operating near critical shipping lanes. Hindustan Timis Pono Kamarga TTPS www.hindustan-times.com/world-live-updates-donald-trump-strikes-straight-of-Hormuz-UAE-Dubai-news-ceasefire-peace talks Pakistan 1017782895071183 html.utm_source=chatgpt.com. Warning shots were reportedly fired during tense maritime encounters, while surveillance aircraft tracked rapid movement across the region. Neither side immediately described the incidents as full-scale combat, but that distinction did little to calm fears. In a place as strategically sensitive as Hormuz, even limited confrontation can create global consequences. The danger is not only direct military escalation, it is the uncertainty that spreads outward from it. The Strait of Hormuz is not just another shipping route, it is one of the most economically critical choke points on Earth. Oil exports from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the UAE, and other major producers move through this narrow corridor every day. Any disruption, even temporary, can send shockwaves through energy markets worldwide. That vulnerability is exactly why the strait carries so much geopolitical weight. It gives regional tensions the power to become global crises almost instantly. And as reports of clashes spread, that transformation was already happening in real time. Shipping companies reacted first. Tankers slowed movement through the area as operators assessed risk conditions. Maritime insurers raised premiums sharply, increasing costs for every vessel entering the Gulf. Some carriers reportedly began exploring alternative routes where possible, despite the logistical complications and additional expense. Every hour of uncertainty added pressure to global supply systems. Because when Hormuz becomes unstable, the world economy starts recalculating immediately. Oil markets responded with equal speed. Prices surged as traders reacted to fears that the clashes could escalate further or disrupt shipping flows entirely. Energy analysts warned that prolonged instability in the strait could trigger a supply shock capable of driving inflation higher across multiple economies. Markets understand something governments often struggle to admit quickly. Systems built on constant movement are extremely vulnerable to uncertainty. The oil itself matters, but confidence in uninterrupted flow matters just as much, and confidence was beginning to crack. Inside Washington, emergency monitoring intensified. The White House, Pentagon, and intelligence agencies began reviewing real-time developments as officials attempted to determine whether the clashes represented isolated incidents or the start of something larger. Publicly, the administration emphasized restraint while reaffirming its commitment to protecting freedom of navigation in international waters. But behind closed doors, the concern was obvious. The timing could not have been worse. Diplomatic channels were still active. Negotiations involving a possible peace framework were reportedly ongoing. And now, military confrontation was threatening to overtake diplomacy completely. Iranian officials also moved carefully in their public statements. Tehran accused U.S. forces of provocation while insisting that Iran would defend its territorial and strategic interests in the Gulf. At the same time, officials avoided fully closing the door on diplomatic engagement. That balancing act reflected the complexity of the moment. Iran wanted to demonstrate resistance without triggering uncontrolled escalation. The United States wanted to maintain pressure without being drawn into a wider regional war. But in environments like Hormuz, control is fragile. One miscalculation can rapidly overwhelm strategy. The deeper problem was psychological. Markets, governments, and militaries were no longer responding only to actual events, they were responding to the possibility of what could happen next. Could shipping routes remain open? Would the clashes intensify? Could regional proxy groups become involved? Would diplomacy survive the pressure? These unanswered questions became part of the crisis itself. In geopolitical conflicts, uncertainty is often as destabilizing as direct violence. Allies of the United States reacted with growing concern. European governments urged immediate de-escalation, warning that instability in the Gulf could damage already fragile global economic conditions. Asian economies heavily dependent on Middle Eastern energy watched developments with particular anxiety. China, Japan, South Korea, and India all rely significantly on oil flowing through Hormuz. For them, the strait is not an abstract geopolitical issue. It is a direct economic lifeline. By midday, the atmosphere surrounding the region had fundamentally changed. What was supposed to be a delicate moment of diplomacy had become another dangerous flashpoint. The ceasefire discussions and peace proposals now existed alongside active maritime confrontation, and that contradiction made the situation far more unpredictable. Peace was being negotiated at the same moment the strait was sliding back toward conflict. The world had seen crises in Hormuz before, but each new confrontation carries unique risks because the global system has become even more interconnected, more dependent on stable energy flows, and more vulnerable to disruption. The clashes themselves may have been limited in scale, but their impact was not. They shook markets, alarmed governments, disrupted shipping systems, and reminded the world of a harsh reality. Modern conflicts are not contained by geography anymore. And as the smoke of those early confrontations drifted across the Gulf, another realization was beginning to spread quietly through world capitals and trading floors alike. The real danger might not be the clashes themselves. It might be what happens next. As clashes continued to flare in the Strait of Hormuz and oil markets struggled to stabilize, attention inside Washington shifted toward one critical question: how would Tehran respond to the latest American peace proposal? Behind the military tension and public warnings, diplomacy was still alive but barely. The White House believed a narrow opening still existed for de-escalation, and President Donald Trump was now waiting for Iran's official answer. The problem was that the response was expected at the exact moment the region seemed to be drifting back toward confrontation. Peace and conflict were unfolding side by side, and no one could say which would win first. Inside the White House, the atmosphere was tense but cautiously hopeful. According to senior officials, the administration expected Tehran's response within hours. Secretary of State Marco Rubio publicly confirmed that Washington was awaiting an answer to its latest framework aimed at ending the conflict and reopening the Strait of Hormuz. The Guardian won. The proposal reportedly included phased de-escalation measures, partial easing of restrictions around Iranian shipping, and broader talks tied to regional security and nuclear oversight. The message from Washington was clear. Diplomacy remained possible, but only if Tehran agreed to engage seriously. Trump himself tried to project confidence publicly. Speaking to reporters, he hinted that he expected a response tonight and suggested that a deal could still prevent a wider regional crisis. The Times of India too. But even as he spoke optimistically about negotiations, military tensions in Hormuz were intensifying. U.S. naval forces had reportedly exchanged fire with Iranian units only hours earlier. Tankers were being intercepted. Maritime alerts were spreading. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. Peace was being negotiated at the same moment the strait was sliding back toward conflict. The proposed deal itself reflected the enormous pressure both sides were facing. Reports indicated that Washington's framework involved reopening commercial access through Hormuz while gradually reducing elements of the naval blockade surrounding Iranian ports. New York Post 3. In exchange, the United States reportedly wanted strict guarantees involving uranium enrichment, maritime security, and future negotiations over Iran's regional activities. For the White House, this was not simply about ending clashes in the Gulf. It was about restoring strategic stability before the economic consequences became uncontrollable. Inside Tehran, however, the situation was far more complicated. Iranian officials publicly stated that the proposal would be reviewed at Iran's own pace. Hindustan Times 4. That phrase carried significant meaning. It suggested that Tehran was in no hurry to respond under pressure, particularly while military incidents continued in Hormuz. Iran's leadership faced competing pressures internally. Hardline factions argued that accepting American terms too quickly would signal weakness after months of sanctions, naval pressure, and military escalation. More pragmatic voices reportedly viewed the growing economic damage and regional instability as reasons to keep negotiations alive. The result was strategic hesitation. This hesitation frustrated Washington. American officials believed the pressure campaign had created leverage strong enough to push Tehran toward compromise. Iran's currency had weakened dramatically, oil exports were constrained, and the naval blockade was increasing economic strain daily. But Iran's leadership appeared determined to show that it would not negotiate from a position of surrender. This was one of the central dynamics shaping the entire crisis. The United States wanted quick compliance. Iran wanted to avoid appearing controlled by external pressure. That difference made every negotiation slower, more fragile, and more dangerous. Meanwhile, the clashes in Hormuz continued, creating uncertainty across global markets. Oil traders monitored every diplomatic signal and military movement simultaneously. One headline suggested progress in negotiations. Another reported fresh maritime confrontation. Investors no longer knew which narrative would dominate the next day: de-escalation or escalation. That uncertainty itself became part of the crisis. Markets can process bad news. What they struggle with is instability without direction. International mediators intensified their efforts quietly behind the scenes. Pakistan and Qatar were reportedly involved in facilitating indirect communication between Washington and Tehran, while European governments pushed strongly for restraint. The Guardian won. Allies feared that if diplomacy collapsed entirely, the Strait could become the center of a much wider confrontation. The stakes were not just regional anymore. Hormuz affects global shipping, inflation, energy pricing, and economic confidence worldwide. Every major economy had a reason to want the talks to succeed. Yet military realities kept colliding with diplomatic hopes. U.S. forces reportedly struck and disabled Iranian-flagged tankers accused of violating blockade rules near the Gulf of Oman. The Washington Post 5. Iran condemned the actions as violations of the fragile ceasefire and warned of catastrophic consequences if provocations continued. Hindustan Times 4. The danger was obvious. Every military incident made political compromise harder. Every delay in negotiations increased the risk of another clash. And every clash pushed markets and governments closer to panic. By evening, the world had entered a strange and deeply unstable moment. Officially, diplomacy was still alive. Back-channel communication continued. Negotiators waited for Tehran's answer. Trump publicly insisted a deal remain possible. But beneath those diplomatic signals, military pressure was building rapidly. Warships remained in position. Oil prices stayed elevated. Shipping companies prepared for further disruption. Nobody trusted the calm because there was no real calm left. The entire region now seemed suspended between two futures. One path led toward de-escalation, reopened shipping routes, and fragile diplomacy. The other led toward renewed confrontation, wider economic shock, and the collapse of negotiations altogether. And somewhere inside Tehran, officials were deciding which direction the region would move next. Because at this stage of the crisis, everything depended on one answer. As Washington waited for Tehran's response to the proposed peace framework and naval tensions continued rising in the Gulf, the entire world was being reminded of one critical reality. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a waterway. It is a pressure point capable of shaking the global economy within hours. Every tanker passing through the narrow corridor carried more than oil. It carried the stability of energy markets, inflation expectations, shipping systems, and investor confidence across the planet. And now, with clashes increasing and diplomacy hanging by a thread, that pressure point was beginning to crack under strain. The geography of Hormuz explains why the situation had become so dangerous so quickly. The strait is only about 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, yet nearly a fifth of the world's oil supply passes through it every day. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates all depend heavily on the route to move energy exports toward Europe and Asia. Tankers crossing the strait feed global industries, transportation systems, and national economies. When Hormuz operates normally, the world barely notices it. But when instability enters the region, the entire global system begins reacting immediately. That reaction was already underway. Shipping companies had started slowing vessel movements through the Gulf as the risk environment intensified. Maritime insurers raised premiums sharply, making every shipment more expensive. Some tankers were reportedly waiting offshore for military clearance before entering the strait, while others began exploring alternative routes despite the enormous logistical complications involved. Every delay mattered because energy markets operate on expectations as much as actual supply. If traders believe flows could be disrupted tomorrow, prices rise today. Iran understood this dynamic perfectly. Tehran's strategy was never based on matching American military strength directly. Instead, it relied on leveraging the vulnerability built into the global economy itself. Iranian officials repeatedly warned that if their own oil exports were restricted through sanctions and naval pressure, regional stability could not be guaranteed. The message was strategic. Iran was signaling that economic warfare against Tehran could trigger economic consequences for everyone else as well. This is what made Hormuz such a powerful bargaining chip. Iran did not need to fully close the strait to create pressure. Even limited disruptions, sporadic clashes, or uncertainty around tanker safety could increase costs globally. Insurance rates would climb, shipping delays would expand, oil prices would surge, inflation fears would spread. The mere possibility of instability was enough to destabilize markets. That is the nature of interconnected systems. Their greatest strength, global integration, is also their greatest vulnerability. The United States responded by intensifying efforts to maintain freedom of navigation in the Gulf. American warships increased patrol operations near critical shipping lanes while surveillance aircraft monitored tanker routes and Iranian naval activity. Officially, Washington described these operations as defensive measures designed to protect international commerce and stabilize the region. But every additional deployment also increased the risk of confrontation. Hormuz had become a place where military strategy and economic fragility were colliding in real time. Markets reacted accordingly. Oil prices remained highly volatile, moving sharply with every report from the Gulf. Traders monitor satellite imagery, naval positioning, and diplomatic statements simultaneously because any single development could shift expectations instantly. Energy analysts warned that if the crisis escalated further, the world could face a prolonged supply shock capable of reigniting global inflation. Central banks and governments began reassessing economic forecasts, understanding that Hormuz instability threatened far more than regional shipping. A familiar insight from investors like Warren Buffett started circulating again across financial commentary. Markets can survive political tension. They can survive elections, sanctions, and even regional conflicts. But markets panic when critical systems become uncertain, and the Strait of Hormuz was one of the most critical systems in the modern global economy. If traders lose confidence in the uninterrupted movement of energy, every sector eventually feels the impact. Transportation costs rise, manufacturing slows, consumer prices increase, growth expectations weaken, the fear spreads outward in waves. The contrast before and after the latest clashes was dramatic. Before the naval confrontations, the strait was viewed as tense but manageable. Diplomats believed the pressure campaign and negotiations could coexist without fully destabilizing the region. After the clashes, that assumption began collapsing. Markets no longer viewed Hormuz as merely a geopolitical hotspot. They viewed it as an active risk zone capable of disrupting the global economy at any moment. Allies of Washington grew increasingly nervous. European governments pushed harder for de-escalation, fearing that another energy crisis could weaken already fragile economies. Asian nations dependent on Gulf oil imports monitored developments with growing urgency. China, Japan, South Korea, and India all understood the same reality. If Hormuz becomes unstable for an extended period, no major economy escapes the consequences. This shared vulnerability is what gives the strait such immense geopolitical importance. It transforms local conflict into global pressure almost instantly. Inside Tehran, officials recognized the leverage this vulnerability provided. Even under sanctions and military pressure, Iran still possessed the ability to disrupt one of the world's most important trade arteries. That ability changed the balance of the confrontation. The United States could project overwhelming military power across the Gulf, but military superiority alone could not fully eliminate the economic risks tied to Hormuz, and that exposed a deeper truth about modern conflict. Control of systems often matters as much as control of territory. By the end of the day, one conclusion had become unavoidable. The Strait of Hormuz was no longer simply the location of a regional crisis. It had become the center of a global economic stress test. Oil markets, shipping networks, inflation forecasts, military strategy, and diplomacy were all now connected to the same narrow corridor of water. Hormuz was not just a waterway anymore. It was the pressure point holding the entire crisis together. As tensions in the Strait of Hormuz intensified and diplomacy struggled to keep pace with military escalation, the shockwaves began spreading rapidly across global markets and international alliances. What had started as clashes between U.S. and Iranian forces was now evolving into a broader crisis affecting energy prices, investor confidence, diplomatic relationships, and economic stability worldwide. The world was no longer watching the Gulf from a distance. It was reacting to it in real time. Oil markets moved first. Crude prices surged sharply again as traders responded to reports of tanker disruptions, naval confrontations, and uncertainty surrounding Tehran's response to the proposed peace deal. Every new headline from Hormuz triggered immediate reactions across energy exchanges. Traders understood the danger clearly. If the strait became unstable for an extended period, millions of barrels of oil could face delays or rerouting. Even partial disruption would tighten supply chains and increase costs globally. Markets do not wait for complete shutdowns to panic. They react to risk itself. And the risk surrounding Hormuz was growing larger by the hour. Stock markets around the world turned volatile almost immediately. In New York, major indices swung sharply throughout the trading session as investors tried to balance hopes for diplomacy against fears of escalation. Airline stocks fell under pressure from rising fuel costs. Manufacturing companies faced concerns about supply chain disruptions and inflation. Shipping and logistics firms experienced intense volatility as maritime insurance costs surged. Investors began moving money out of risk-sensitive sectors and into safer assets, signaling a broader loss of confidence. European markets reacted with equal anxiety. Governments across Europe had already been dealing with slowing growth and fragile energy conditions. The possibility of another major oil shock threatened to worsen inflation and weaken industrial output even further. Energy-intensive sectors like chemicals, manufacturing, and transportation faced heavy selling pressure as analysts warned about rising operational costs. The reaction reflected more than temporary fear. It reflected concern that prolonged instability in Hormuz could damage economic recovery across the continent. Asian markets also came under pressure overnight. Economies heavily dependent on Gulf energy imports monitored developments with growing alarm. China, Japan, South Korea, and India all rely significantly on oil moving through the strait. For them, Hormuz is not just a geopolitical issue, it is an economic lifeline. As tensions escalated, investors in Asia shifted toward safer positions, while governments quietly reviewed contingency plans for potential supply disruptions. The crisis was no longer regional. It had become a global economic threat. Safe haven assets surged as uncertainty spread. Gold prices climbed rapidly as investors sought protection from geopolitical instability. Government bonds attracted strong demand, pushing yields lower as capital flowed toward perceived safety. These market moves carried a familiar message. Investors were becoming less concerned with maximizing gains and more focused on preserving stability. That transition is one of the clearest signals that fear is entering financial systems.